What are some things that make for a good parent? What kind of characteristics? And yeah, I would say the two that we've already talked about the most of what you guys said are indeed attentiveness and then also positive reinforcement when we talked about attachment and what makes for what's called maternal sensitivity. That is attentiveness to needs, physical or emotional needs, but then also kind of positive signals that you give back to the kid. Whether it's an infant who kind of looks up at you with a big smile and then you give them a big smile back, the kid learning that what he or she does makes a difference. We haven't gotten to positive reinforcement for grades and things like that, but we kind of this idea of warmth. Diana Baumrind, who's kind of developed these dimensions of parenting, has two big dimensions, warmth and control. We've kind of already talked about warmth in a sense, responsiveness, praise, expression of positive emotion. I think I've mentioned how this kind of warmth dimension is really, people talk about how critical it is for kind of moral and conscience development. Like, you have to have that kind of positive base, that attachment, that bond, for kids to want to pay attention to you, to want to learn your rules. Like, if they don't trust you, if they don't feel that connection, what do they care about your rules? Maybe your rules don't work for them because they don't feel good about your relationship. With the terrible twos, a whole new kind of set of requirements come, and actually even before the terrible twos, but especially with the terrible twos, especially when kids start walking around, which is earlier than that. But levels of control. How much control do you have over your child, under controlling or over controlling? It becomes important. Baumrind's 4 categories kind of map onto these two dimensions, warmth and control. High warmth and high control is authoritative. You probably learned these terms in Psych 100, if not other classes. Lots of control, but not as much warmth, or not as much expression of the warmth. Authoritarian. We're going to go over each of these individually. Permissive can be very warm relationship, but there's not so many rules or level of control. And then, if both aren't there, uninvolved. What's termed uninvolved parenting. All right, authoritative. Tough love is a good thing. I think for most parents, it feels like tough love. Setting limits is not something that comes. It comes somewhat naturally, but kids push buttons, so you have to kind of stay on them and be skeptical, especially when they get older, about motivations, about, like Melissa was saying, splitting. Democratic parenting. Actually, what Melissa was talking about was a good example of some of the aspects of authoritative parenting, which is like rules but with rationale stated. Or in terms of democratic parenting, the idea is that the child is kind of in on it in a way. Now, I don't really like the term, psychologists have used this term democratic parenting. I don't particularly like it, because what's a democracy? Yeah, rule by the people. Well, that's not true. It's not that the kid has equal say, but that the kid has some input into what's going on, so that a typical example is a child is given choices. They get to choose between choices for what cereal they want, or what shoes they want, or whatever. So that the kid's input is important. So, but at least the parents are open to feedback and allow voices to be heard and help kind of describe to them why the rules exist, even if it's not the rules that the kids want. Authoritarian, like I said before, highly controlling. Many rules imposed, kind of micromanagement of the kid's behavior is pretty characteristic, meaning like just rules throughout the day for little things, like kind of always on the kid about things. It's kind of like, you know, I think I used the example earlier in the semester, kind of like a kid approaching a stove, and like, you know, not touching a hot stove is obviously a bad thing. But, you know, at what point do you stop the kid from touching the hot stove? Is it when they're starting to reach, or is it as they're walking halfway across the room? You know, like a kid sitting in a chair. Obviously, you don't want them leaning all the way back because they could fall and hurt themselves. Well, do you wait till they're leaning back to set the rule, or do you kind of see them leaning back and then all of a sudden you're like, don't you lean back in that chair? I mean, not that that's necessarily bad either. But the point is kind of on kids about things that might be called risky behaviors, but they're not necessarily bad themselves. There's nothing wrong about walking towards the stove. The problem is when you actually touch the stove. So on kids about every little thing about what they're doing. But in addition to that, not explaining all those rules either. Kind of strict obedience is expected. So you set the rules. It's typical that they don't expect any kind of conversation about that. If the kid questions it, you know, they might get upset that the kid is questioning why, you know, what the rule is about. There's no room for discussion about it. Kind of, and not in all cases, but in some cases, with authoritarian parents, you see kind of like what's called love withdrawal as a technique to discipline a kid. Meaning like, don't you know, or you don't like, why do you always, let's see an example. Why are you always talking back to me? Don't you love me? Or what are you trying to give me a heart attack? You know, kind of using either the relationship or even the parent's health to kind of discipline a kid, as opposed to kind of effectively asserting power without kind of having to use the relationship like that. I actually worked with, I mean, it can be a tough situation. I worked with a mom and a kid, it was a preschool kid who was kind of being disruptive. Like, mom was having a really hard time handling him. He was running around the house and stuff. But she had actually very real health concerns. She got fatigued easily. She had diabetes, but she had something else in her legs. This was years ago. I forget what it was. But the point is, she couldn't run around the house with the kid. And in fact, when she got worked up, it was potentially unhealthy for her, or risky for her own self, to have to kind of like yell at the kid. And but she would say to the kid things like, you know, are you trying to get me to pass out, or things like that. And so that was a difficult situation. We tried to, you know, did my best to help her kind of discipline the kid, but the bottom line, it was difficult for her. But tried to help her figure out different ways of kind of controlling the kid without using her health and their relationship as a means of discipline. Permissive can be a very warm relationship. It's just that the rules aren't there. And the rules aren't there maybe for one of two different reasons. One is maybe they're just not imposed, or but maybe the parent isn't there, like in terms of, you know, nobody's in the house in the afternoon, nobody's monitoring the kid. I remember a buddy of mine in high school, you know, his parents were great, but you know, I go to the house and nobody was over there. I mean, he had like 5 brothers and sisters, and it was so much fun going over there. The parents were never there. And it was a great place to hang out. And the kids really weren't that bad. It wasn't like they were, you know, terrible delinquents or anything. But, you know, there's nobody home in the afternoon, so it was a good place to hang out. So these are parents that, you know, love their kids, but either because, for whatever personal reasons, aren't effective disciplinarians, or like I said, aren't there. Over-involved parents would fall into this category. You probably know of parents, friends of yours, or maybe your own parents that kind of wanted to be friends with the kid more than parent the kids in terms of disciplining. That would fall into this. You know, there is, it's a tough defining line. I remember working in a substance abuse clinic. I remember this one girl, and her mom came in. What was it? The girl was in there for smoking weed and something else. I forget what the other drug was. But anyway, but I just remember meeting this mom, and they had this obviously very warm relationship, like sitting in this group therapy room. They were kind of like hugging on each other, and so that was very nice. But it was also clear that at critical junctures, as they told the stories of what went on in the house, you know, mom just had a difficult time disciplining her, that she was kind of looking for friendship from the girl as opposed to standing up and being the parent and the disciplinarian. And of course, you can see situations like this. This is one of the things, effects of divorce. We're going to talk about divorce. Like I said, we'll probably get to that on Monday more. But post-divorce, one thing that often happens is mom, you know, doesn't have that support from dad anymore, kind of has her own needs or whatever, and sometimes gets over-involved in terms of being friends with, like a teenage daughter, and then kind of loses that, kind of, in a sense, loses the respect of the daughter, or especially the son, for kind of being a disciplinarian. Lack of monitoring. You know, does the parent know? Like I know I had to always give a phone number wherever I went in the afternoon. Although I mix that up a little bit sometimes. Like, you know, this was a good trick. Like, so the number was 972. No. So you know how like in an area, there's like the first three numbers are often the same. You know, like there'd be a couple of different types of first three numbers. So I often switch the first three numbers and say, oh, yeah, I screwed up, sorry about that. But that only works like a couple times. You know, come up with a different strategy. But anyway, but the point is they asked, so that was good. They were on me about kind of a phone number for where I'd be and who I was. You see those commercials? I really like them. It's just a little pot commercials. They're like kind of anti-drug campaign where there's a parent, they're like parents. It's kind of funny. It starts with like a mom and a dad at a door at the bedroom, and they're like, it's just a little pot, and slams the door. The dad slams the door in the mom's face, I think is how it goes. And what they're practicing is the kid's reaction to when they confront them about smoking weed. And so, you know, I really like that because I think that's a very real kind of situation and kind of shows how stressful it can be to be a parent and have to confront kids about something like that, knowing the kid might explode and think it's not a big deal. And at some level, the kid does know it's a big deal, but they're going to explode anyway to hopefully have you back down. But so again, there's parents without the kind of emotional resources to kind of stand up and do that kind of confrontation, to do the kind of tough love it takes to be an effective parent. Uninvolved, like I said, low warmth and levels of control. These would be kind of the most extreme, kind of like the disorganized attachment. These would be the most extreme cases. Own kind of maternal psychopathology, maybe depression or whatever, that makes them very unavailable for parenting, maybe situations where they didn't even want the kid in the first place for whatever reasons, and therefore kind of have a distance to them about the child. Okay, we were talking about parenting on Wednesday. We're going to pick up with that, and that'll probably be what we go through today. And like I said, we're going to talk about intelligence tests and why, in particular, there seems to be a difference between average black and average white kids in American intelligence test taking. We had just talked about the examples of the different styles of parenting, if you remember. And I had asked about the take-home message, like if you were a kid and had this kind of encounter with your parent, not just once, but over many, many times, what kind of take-home messages, how might that shape how you think about yourself and your interactions with other adults and or even other kids. But I wanted to go over those, we're going to go over those more now. We're going to talk about what are the kind of child behaviors that are associated with these different types of behaviors by parents. Also going to talk about kind of changes in the family structure in America, and then talk about divorce a little bit as one particular example of that, and how that may or may not impact kids. So authoritative is associated with kind of more positive things. If you remember, giving kids choices, they get to choose. They get a sense of, okay, my opinion matters. You feel like parents are on your side. So not surprisingly, like self-esteem, self-reliance are associated with this kind of parenting style, and just generally positive, kind of cheerful, cooperative type behaviors in kids. For authoritarian, kids of authoritarian parents, and I need to mention that these are trends, so it's not that for every authoritative parent or every authoritarian parent, the kid is necessarily going to develop these kind of behaviors or thinking patterns. But it's a trend where you tend to see kids of authoritarian parents having kind of poor senses of self. But so their conduct is usually okay. Kind of all setting a lot of limits on kids, controlling their behaviors. It's not that they necessarily act out badly when they get into school with other kids. But it was more what's called internalizing. In psychology, you have things that are called internalizing and externalizing. Internalizing is anxiety, depression, self-esteem, things that are kind of more internal to kids. Externalizing is bad behavior, getting into fights, skipping school, just being generally disruptive in classrooms, things like that. So you tend to see more of the internalizing things associated with the authoritarian. We talked about how, well, what's the take-home message? If you don't get to choose, have any voice in what's going on in your life in terms of decisions in the family, if that's repeated lots and lots of times over your childhood, you may develop a sense that my opinion doesn't matter. You kind of lose the interest in expressing your opinion or putting your 2 cents in because it never makes a difference. I gave you the, did I tell you about the dogs, learned helplessness? Did we talk about that in the dogs? No? This is a classic study with this idea of learned helplessness. I'm sure many of you heard that term, but dogs, this is a study done in the early 70s, were put in this cage with 2 sides to its electric cage, and it was wired so that the dog could be shocked. Well, there was a gate between the 2 cages, and there was a button, and the dog could learn to use their nose to push the button and open the gate so they could get to the other side. It was only shocked in the one side, not the other. And so the dog would be trained to learn that they could open this gate by hitting the thing. But then the the connection between the button and the gate would then be cut off. So then all of a sudden they've learned that it makes a difference to hit this button, but then so they can escape the shock on the one side, but then they learn that that all of a sudden it doesn't make a difference, that doesn't open the gate anymore. And so dogs for a while would try to hit the button to open the gate, and it wouldn't work. They would try for a little while, but then eventually they would just kind of give up. They would just lay down and take the shocks because they've learned that whatever they do doesn't make a difference for avoiding the pain. And it's kind of that study is kind of seen as an analogy for kind of depression in both kids and adults, which is kind of learning that things you do, you don't have much self-efficacy. Things you do don't make a difference. And it was also found that when they then put the trigger back on so that that button would open the gate, that the dogs that had learned to give up, were slow. It was in some cases really difficult to get the dogs to even try to open that gate back up. So the idea is it's kind of an analogy for thinking of depression in people, which is that experiences where whatever you try doesn't make a difference, eventually is going to kind of affect your mood, and you're just going to have to give up. So again, not that kids of authoritarian parents necessarily become depressed. There's also many other parts to that, but that there's a tendency for that kind of thing to happen, maybe in lesser extreme forms. However, like the quiz question just said, this is most true with white American kids. Authoritative parenting has been seen to be associated with positive outcomes in kids in different cultures, different countries. But the same is not true about what I've just been saying here about authoritarian kids even in America among black kids or in Asian cultures. Again, for reasons that we talked about, that more controlling style, or in America in the kind of black community, there's a term, no-nonsense parenting. Kind of like you just don't put up with stuff. You just, what you say goes, and the kids understand that. And so you don't see as clear association between overly controlling types of behaviors without explanations and outcomes for kids in other cultures. And we also saw the spanking thing, that kind of controlling in terms of physical coercion, not as most true for white kids in America and not true as for black kids in America, or at least that association isn't as strong. Permissive, so that's the one where there's a warmth between the parent and kid, but that either the parent just isn't around or maybe gives up on, like, sets a demand and just kind of gives up easily, or maybe doesn't set a demand in the first place. So you see a relationship with externalizing behaviors. That's more true for boys than girls. That girls you don't see kind of externalizing behaviors in terms of fighting so much as physical fighting, that is, but you do see things like more risk for teen pregnancy and other kind of outcomes like that, school failure. The self-esteem of kids from permissive parenting is often fine. Like the bully, in 5th grade, 7th grade, 9th grade, doesn't necessarily have bad self-esteem, at least not at that time. Maybe does, but not necessarily. The kid who's kind of grown up without a lot of rules may feel very good about themselves. But you do see, they just have a hard time following rules, and that's going to lead to trouble, like in terms of academic failure at school, getting along with other kids. They've learned that, like we talked about, the situation where they kind of whine and then they get their way to get the pair of shoes they want. Well, if that's what you're learning at home, and then you go to school and another kid has something you want to play with, or lunch money, or whatever, you might be learning that being bullied, being coercive is what it takes to get your way and try it out on other kids. Although the self-esteem longer term may suffer. If you think about bullies, think about bullies from, say, 7th grade, and then, what do you know about them when they were in high school? Bullies often get a certain degree of popularity or status, at least, even if it's not really popularity, but certain status. They might hang out with the cool kids for a while, but usually, or often in high school, it kind of goes away. People will stop thinking it's cool or putting up with them bullying other people. Most people just let it go if they're bullying somebody else. But by high school, kids are kind of not thinking that's cool even. Permissiveness also definitely see more substance use. Again, we've already been talking about that. That's not surprising. If nobody's watching the kids in the afternoon, what are they going to get into? They're certainly at risk for getting into drugs. Uninvolved is the most serious, as I talked about, and it's kind of a combination of the other kinds of outcomes. It's relatively more rare to have uninvolved parents, but like I mentioned before, kind of depressed parents or whatever kind of personal reasons that makes it difficult to be kind of attentive and there, emotionally present to their kids. So you see some kind of bad outcomes with that.